Selling property with tenants through the probate process in California is our topic today. Let's get started. Having a renter living in a house, a condo, or other property that you're trying to sell when involved with a probate, it adds a wrinkle to the already somewhat complicated process of selling a probate house. For purposes of marketing and showing a property to its best advantage, we have to take into account that the tenants live in the property, that it's the tenant's home. The tenants, of course, have rights under the law, and there's either a legal lease or a month-to-month rental agreement, and you're wanting to sell. Depending on the situation, selling a house with a tenant, that might be a benefit to some buyers, but it might be a deal breaker to others. I just finished helping a wonderful man, Mike. His brother had passed away. Mike lives in Portland, and his brother left a 3-unit property here in San Diego that Mike was appointed as the administrator of and needed to sell it. All 3 units had tenants living in them, so I had to be really cautious about respecting the tenants' rights while helping Mike to get what he wanted, which was a sold property. The property was being handled by a property manager whose feelings got a little hurt that he didn't get hired to help Mike, but Mike had seen my YouTube channel and he and I had a Zoom meeting together, and he chose to have me help him with this delicate process. Now, I own rental properties myself, and I always want to be respectful to other people, no matter what. And so I had to work diligently to keep the tenants involved in the process by sending emails to them when I was going to show the property, as well as posting notices on their front doors within 48 hours before I needed to show the property. Or during the process, once we had a buyer, we needed to schedule time for the buyer to do their inspections. Now, in this particular case, having tenants in place was not a deal breaker because the buyer was planning on having tenants anyway. Overall, the marketing and showing of a probate property with tenants in place is more complicated. And if there wasn't a tenant involved, it definitely goes a lot smoother. Now, in some cases, you might have an option of actually having the tenant move out prior to the marketing and showing and successful sale of a probate house. And if you have a tenant that is not willing to allow you to have showings, is going to cooperate with showings, is going to keep your property in relatively decent condition for the showings, you might want to consider working towards having them move out. If you do go through the process of selling a house with tenants, you'll want to make sure that the tenant is happy and cooperative. And that's why in the case of Mike's situation, I was very respectful to the tenants' rights, and they really were willing to work with me. If it turns out that in some cases it's a single family residence or a condo, the tenant may actually want to buy the property. So before putting the house directly on the market, my recommendation is that there is an offer to the tenant to purchase the property. So I never forget to ask. When I meet with executors or administrators that do have a tenant in place, the first question they ask is, can we actually sell the property with the tenant living there? When an executor or administrator wants to sell a house in probate with the tenant in place, the simple answer is yes. In fact, most states have laws in place that if there is a lease, the tenant has the right to stay in the property even when it's going through a sale. However, even though you can sell with a tenant, doesn't mean that you necessarily should. Before we put your property on the market, you'll want to consider the pros and the cons of selling a home in probate with the tenants still living there. And in the case of Mike's situation, having the tenants living there worked out perfectly because the buyer got to buy the property. He then had the intention of providing a 60-day notice to one of the tenants of the unit that needed the most updating, and then he was going to work his way through the other tenants to get all the properties updated. Anyway, that's the plan he told me about. The best you can do is to weigh the pros and the cons of selling a home in probate with the tenant. You'll want to consider the following through the probate process. You'll want to consider the terms of the tenancy. if the tenancy is month to month, you can start the process of removing the tenant by giving them a notice. If they have lived there for less than a year, most cases that isn't the case, a 30-day notice is sufficient. In most cases, tenants have been in the property more than a year, then a 60-day notice is necessary. We'll always discuss the situation and what makes the most sense, meaning to leave the month-to-month tenant in the property or to wait out the notice and then put the property on the market once the tenant moves out. If the tenant has a lease, you'll want to consider the time left on the lease. A long-term tenant may attract certain buyers, such as investors, if they don't want to move into the property themselves. But of course, the opposite could be true, that if the buyer wants to move in the home as their own home, then a long-term tenant lease would not be a benefit. Many real estate investors are happy to pick up a property that has a good tenant, like in the case of Mike's sale, but I like to have a property open to all buyers in the market. So that's the things where we have to decide what is the best option for your particular situation. So considering where the property is and what type of property it is, in areas where there's a lot of renters in a complex, an investor may pay fair market value for the property and have an investment property that they can continue to keep rented. But again, if a family wants to move in quickly to a single family residence or a condo, that could be an issue. We'll want to also examine the market price of the property. If a property is being looked at by investors, they're going to want to have a certain return on their money. So we have to be able to work out all those numbers to make sure that keeping the tenant is the best way to go, or removing the tenant is a better option so that you get a higher amount of money, because investors are always going to offer less on a property than a family that wants to move into a home and have it be their home. So I will help you to put yourself in the investor's shoes and determine if it would be a good idea to leave the tenant in place. Another thing to really consider is if the tenant will keep the property up so that it shows well to potential buyers. A tenant that doesn't keep up with the housekeeping is a definite liability. A tenant that isn't responsive to communication is a liability. And a tenant that is just difficult is the biggest liability. We don't want the tenant to be in a power position to hinder our ability to get a good price through the sale of the probate house. On the other hand, if the tenant is cooperative, is clean, responds to communications from you and me, such as requests to show the property, and who is just generally willing to assist, that particular tenant is an asset. Also, keep in mind any current tenants that owe money, that are behind in their rent, or in some cases with probates have below market rent. That is a headache that few buyers are willing to take on. So what to do when you have a current tenant who would potentially hurt your chances of selling a probate house in the market? Once you've examined those pros and cons, what are your options if you determine it's better to sell without the tenant? Again, if they are a month-to-month tenant, you're in luck. You can do a 30 or 60-day notice and hopefully they move out within that timeline. You're always going to want to make sure that you check your local laws to make sure you're within the laws of being able to provide these notices to the tenants to move out. You know, as we all know, with the COVID situation, there has been laws here in California where we could not ask the tenants to move no matter what until the moratoriums expired. If your tenant has a long-term lease, which is rare that people do more than a year lease, but it does happen, then you may have more problems. The best thing to do is attempt to negotiate with that tenant. I have helped with situations where we have negotiated cash for keys and helped the tenant by giving them the cash to be able to move to another residence. If that tenant accepts the deal and you're going to want something in writing, usually drafted by an attorney for the cash to keys, in that document that the attorney would draft in most cases, it's going to have some verbiage in there about when the tenant needs to be moved out and what the condition of the property should be left in. If you have an agreement with the tenant and we go ahead and put the property on the market because the tenant is cooperative, then we can always have a clause that the property will be vacant upon closing. And typically I would have that happen within 5 days of the close of escrow date. That way we quickly change the locks and we know that the tenant will have vacated the property, avoiding any kind of chaos or drama. Because I have heard that someone negotiated a move out with a tenant, and it can be a bit risky if the tenant decides to ignore the document that they signed and they don't move out. That's why I always make sure the property is vacant 5 days before, because we don't want the new owner to have a situation where they have to evict the person living in the property, because that ultimately would be our problem also. Because the new owner could hold the estate legally responsible for all the expenses and the cost of not having a vacant property. So we're going to avoid that. And if you can't come to an agreement with the tenant, then you simply need to wait out the lease in some cases before the property is placed on the market. I hope you found this of value. If you did, hit that like button, subscribe to my channel, and also hit the bell button so you are notified when I post my weekly video all about probate real estate. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.